Welcome everyone to the Robert C. Byrd Center for Legislative Studies, and my name is Ray Smock, and I'm the director of the Byrd Center, for those of you who don't know me. And also welcome to day 10 of the shutdown of the United States government. When we planned this talk months ago, we had no idea that we would be meeting in the midst of a shutdown, which only adds a little bit more, I think, drama to the history of the House and the Senate. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce my longtime dear friend and the Dean of Congressional Historians, Dick Baker, Richard Allen Baker, the Senate Historian Emeritus. No one in the world has that title of Senate Historian Emeritus except Dick Baker. And he was the first official historian of the United States Senate and served in that capacity from 1975 till his retirement in 2009. Today, the House and the Senate are about as unpopular as they have ever been in history, not that they've always been that popular, with ratings in the single digits. So the shutdown and the dysfunction, I think, have not been kind to Congress or to the country. And yet, I know I speak for myself as well as Dick, we still think that this institution, and I think most Americans think this, is still a vital center in our republic and in our constitutional system. Dick's new book is called The American Senate, An Insider's History. And it is written with the late Time magazine correspondent, Neil MacNeil. And it couldn't be more timely, I think, with the nation trying to understand the circumstances that we are currently finding ourselves in. The distinguished historian William Leuchtenberg called Dick's book on the Senate the best book on the Senate ever written. And I concur. It really is a marvelous thing. There are very few books that have tried to tackle the full sweep of the Senate, all its entire history. The last one that tried to do that was about 20 years ago, and it was written in 4 volumes by the late Senator Robert C. Byrd. And guess who his chief collaborator was, Senator Byrd's chief collaborator? The Senate historian, Richard Baker. So he's been involved in the 2 great works on the Senate over the last 20 years. Dick is the author of numerous books and articles on the Senate history, including 200 notable days, Senate stories from 1787 to 2002, traditions of the United States Senate. He has a PhD in history, American history, from the University of Maryland, and I am pleased to say that he is a member of the board of directors of the Robert C. Byrd Center for Legislative Studies here. We're honored to have him on our board. During my tenure as historian of the House of Representatives, Dick was my mentor, my dear friend. He guided me through many difficulties as I tried to build the House History Office and used his fine office as a model. We collaborated on many political battles and interesting projects over the course of our tenure there together, including one of our finest behind-the-scenes efforts to help the House and Senate leaders vote on the passage of a bill that created an independent National Archives of the United States of America. So historians in politics can occasionally do a few good things. Before I invite him to the podium, I want to tell you one little story about the late Neil MacNeil, who is the co-author of this new book. He's deceased now, and Dick will tell you more about that story. But when I became the historian of the House back in 1983, I said to, I had a book like this. It was the best book on the House that had been written at the time. And it was also written by Neil MacNeil, who was with Time magazine at the time. And it's called The Forage of Democracy. And so I wondered where he got that wonderful title. Forage of Democracy had a great ring. I thought maybe this was something that Alexander Hamilton had dreamed up, or someone of the founding fathers had said this about the House of Representatives. So I called Neil on the phone, and I said, where did you get that great title for your book, and how did you come by that? And he grumbled on the phone. He was kind of a curmudgeonly kind of a guy to begin with. And he grumbled on the phone. He said, that damn title. He says, my publisher made that up. I never liked it one bit. So much for my attempt to find words of wisdom in the Forge of Democracy. Following tonight's program, I hope you'll join us for some refreshments right outside. And Dr. Baker will be happy to sign books that you might care to purchase. Christmas is just around the corner, and this is a lovely gift for that as well as any other time. So, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Richard Allen Baker.
Thank you. Thank you, Ray, for those very generous remarks, and thanks to all of you for coming out on this very frigid, wet night, but I doubly appreciate it. And it may be cold outside, but it certainly is warm, and we're among friends here for sure. So I want to thank particularly Ray, because Ray's got a few stories about me, and I have a few stories about him, and we can just go ahead and turn the rest of the session over to our mutual stories, but you wouldn't stick around too long, I suspect. And thanks to the Byrd Center, and I also want to thank my wife, Pat Baker, to whom the book is dedicated, who was a big help through the process of putting it all together. You know, on Capitol Hill, it is difficult for a Senate staffer to become a friend of a senator. On Capitol Hill, there are two classes of people. The first includes those with certificates of election, as many of those certificate holders will be very happy to tell you. And the other class is everybody else. Senators, not surprisingly, see Senate staff as people who are there to serve them. And if that service doesn't prove specifically helpful and continuously helpful, sort of what have you done for me lately, kind of attitude, to help the senator become more informed and more reelectable, then the connection ends between the staff and the staff member and the senator. Workers on Capitol Hill are known by the wonderful term employees at will. And that translates to here today, gone tomorrow. You're there at the will of the person who's employed you. I was lucky. I was very lucky. Through the course of my nearly 4 decades on Capitol Hill, I worked for, overall, 300 senators, in the sense that people, as the Senate historian and the staff of the Senate Historical Office, we were there to serve all senators. And there were about that number of senators who moved through the north end of Capitol Hill during that period of time. They were all my bosses, but alone among them, Senator Robert C. Byrd was my friend. I had a relationship with him like no other, and it was the honor of my life and the education of a lifetime. So I'm particularly happy to be able to come out here tonight and just in a public way say thank you to Senator Byrd and thank you to the Byrd Center for the work that it's doing. My association with Senator Byrd began in 1976 when I gave a speech at the annual meeting of the Organization of American Historians, and the speech was about the work of the newly established Senate Historical Office. And so we wanted the word to get out around Capitol Hill that there was such a thing as a Senate Historical Office. And Senator Byrd, very quickly I brought that to his attention. He put it in the Congressional record. So I thought that was the biggest thing ever, to have him do that. Then a little time passed. In 1980, the association began on a little more focused course, as I'll explain shortly. But that course ripened into a genuine friendship, which continued until his death 3 years ago. Attentive readers of the American Senate will note that the book begins and ends with quotations from Senator Byrd. Attentive readers of this week's New York Times will have noticed the reference to Senator Byrd as, quote, one of the historical giants of the Senate. That was this week, New York Times, 3 weeks after his death, 3 years after his death. So the legacy is there for sure. That stature, that of a giant, and the historical giant of the Senate, guaranteed him a major place in any book that purports to talk about the whole history, the whole range of the history of the Senate. I was involved in briefings for brand new senators, and this is something I also enjoyed very much. From 1976, when they organized a program, because there were so many new senators coming in because of the political turbulence of that period, a lot of incumbents being unseated, so we organized a formal program as opposed to the old way that senators used to learn their job, which was to talk to the other senator from their state and hope that something stuck. And it usually was a matter of learning the hard way. And I continued every 2 years participating in that program until I left the Senate staff in 2008. Throughout that 32-year period, I received one question above all others. The question is, paraphrased, liberally interpreted, to a person who has time to read only one book about the history and the culture of the Senate, what title would you recommend? Years earlier, in the 1950s, Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson had a ready response to that question. He admired the book by New York Times Congressional correspondent William S. White, entitled Citadel, The Story of the U.S. Senate. One of Senator Byrd's favorite characterizations of the Senate comes from that volume, and it rings as true today as it did in the 1950s. The quote is, by William White, is, "The Senate lives in an unending yesterday, where the past is never gone, the present never quite decisive, and the future rarely quite visible." Lyndon Johnson liked that quote too, and he gave autographed copies of White's 267-page volume to freshman senators throughout the late 1950s, including, presumably, Senator Byrd. 21 years later, in 1980, Senate Majority Leader Robert Byrd asked the Senate Historical Office for assistance in preparing floor speeches that would help educate him, along with other senators, about the Senate's nearly 2 centuries of existence. Throughout the 1980s, he delivered more than 100 such addresses. Actually, at one point he was up to 93. And he called me and he said, it's the 100th Congress coming up. It's the 200th anniversary. We need to have a nice round number of 100 speeches. So let's see if we can figure out some more speeches. And by the time we were through, we had more than 100 speeches about various aspects of the Senate. In some cases, topical speeches, the history of the Senate parliamentarian, the history of the filibuster, and sometimes chronological speeches, like the Senate during the so-called golden age of Clay, Webster, and Calhoun. And so in honor of the 200th anniversary of the Senate in 1989, something Ray and I were intimately involved in, the Senate, as its major event, or major activity, publication, authorized publication of Senator Byrd's what became a 4-volume history of the Senate. Those 4 volumes amounted to 3,000 pages, and they weighed 20 pounds. And they really did serve as an encyclopedia of Senate history and culture. Senator Byrd loved to present autographed copies of the first 2 volumes, the chronological, one being chronological and the other topical, to freshman senators whose eyes were wide as saucers in most cases. And some of those first-termers claimed very proudly, they'd come up to Senator Byrd and say, over the recess I read volume 1. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. It was a lot of reading. So others said, well, we're not going to read them cover to cover, but we like them as a reference book. It's nice to know they're here. They've got a great index, and a lot of these terms, particularly for newer senators, are unfamiliar, or for senators, terms from the past that are not so current today. The books were very helpful in that regard. And still others found that they were just a great doorstop, and they kind of smiled when you asked if you'd read them. Well, we'll get around to it. But Senator Byrd's 4 volumes earned notable awards from the American Library Association in 1989 and from the Society for History and the Federal Government. So they were taken very seriously on the national stage. never squeeze a plastic bottle that's full of water, because you'll find that it's with you. So we'll do a little housekeeping here. From 2002, the Senate Historical Office had a different answer to the question, what's the best book on the Senate, particularly for new senators, but also for longer serving senators who would very sheepishly come up. And one fairly senior senator one time came up to me and he said, if I knew a quarter of what you know about the history of the Senate, he said, I'd be a much better senator. And needless to say, I wrote that right down, never forgot it. But indeed, that's other senators have sort of suggested that as well, that you come into this strange institution with all its various mysterious and the adjective that's used all the time, arcane rules. Imagine being a brand new senator thrown on the floor, like say Ted Cruz, and having the sense of self-possession to get out there and begin to operate in that environment. Most senators would sort of stand back a little bit and do their homework. And from 2002 on, we were able to say, a good book for you to read. I think you'd really profit. Take you a while to do it. It's 1,000 pages long, but it's Robert Caro's Master of the Senate, which does a wonderful job of setting the stage for the arrival of Lyndon Johnson in the year in the 1950s. And so it focuses on the Senate from the 1850s to the 1950s, how it changed, how it was a leaderless institution until from across the plains marched Lyndon Johnson entered into the world of Washington power brokers and changed it. And Bob Caro makes a very convincing case that indeed is true. And now, drum roll, from Oxford University Press, the reason we're here tonight, a book called The American Senate, An Insider's History by Neil MacNeil. And we talked a lot about the title, what should the title of this book be, and I suggested to the editor at Oxford University Press that Neil had written this book called Forge of Democracy, and she shuddered. And she's, oh my goodness, we don't want to come anywhere near a title like that is so 1960s. We have to keep away from it. So we came up with cute titles and ended up with something that's very descriptive, The American Senate, An Insider's History, because both Neil MacNeil and I, together collectively, we spent almost close to depending on how you do the numbers, close to a century inside those doors watching and observing. And the first thing to be noted about our book is that it's not 4 volumes, it's not even 1,000 pages, it's only 361 pages of text, and it weighs less than 2 pounds, and the e-book edition is even lighter. By my argument, it is the first 1-volume comprehensive history of the Senate to be published, believe it or not, since the late 19th century. I'd heard of Neil MacNeil long before I'd had the opportunity to meet him. This was thanks to 2 books and 1 television show. The first book was the book that Ray just showed you, his History of the House of Representatives, published 50 years ago, Forge of Democracy. The second was a colorful 1970 biography of Senate Republican leader Everett McKinley Dirksen. I also greatly admired MacNeil's commentary on PBS's television program, Washington Week in Review, where he was one of 4 regular panelists from 1967 when that program began for the next 12 years. One day in the late 1970s, my phone rang in the Senate Historical Office, and it was Neil MacNeil, whom I'd never met. And he invited me to lunch. The trouble was that I already had an unbreakable lunch date from somebody who was coming in from out of town for that date, and I didn't feel like I could break that as well. But I didn't want to miss the opportunity I didn't have the courage to say to Neil, I'm a busy man, could you have another date for lunch? And so I said, sure, I'll have lunch. So I ended up that day having 2 lunches, with my friend from out of town and with Neil MacNeil. Our paths crossed again in 1980, when the Illinois-based Everett Dirksen Congressional Research Center, on whose board I was then serving, awarded him its first annual award for distinguished reporting of Congress. That's an award that continues today and is as prestigious now as it was when it was first issued. In 1987, MacNeil retired from Time magazine after 30 years to devote his full attention to a 1-volume history of the Senate. His book on the House had sold well, and his publisher pressed him for a Senate equivalent. MacNeil's experiences as a Harvard College history major and as a Columbia University history graduate student prepared him well for the dual role of a journalist writing for a weekly news magazine and a historian laboring on a book manuscript. He'd written his house book in about 4 years of evenings and weekends, and his hopes that a Senate counterpart would go as easily were, however, soon crushed. After 10 years, his frustrated publisher wrote off the advance royalties paid and tore up the contract. Neil pressed on. He became a more frequent caller to the Senate Historical Office. For the many years that followed, we met occasionally for lunch, and our friendship deepened. In 2005, the 82-year-old MacNeil's health began to deteriorate. With the support of his daughter Deirdre and the helpful intervention of Senate Associate Historian Don Ritchie, Neil began conversation with Don's publisher, Oxford University Press. A contract resulted in, and in 2008, the gravely ill MacNeil submitted a manuscript. Oxford, in turn, sent the manuscript to several anonymous reviewers, including me. And I responded in detail, reporting that I saw a very good book hiding in Neil's massive document. But I recommended it needed to be carved out and reduced to a size that would appeal to senators, to Senate staff, to general readers, and to congressional scholars. Neil died later in 2008. And the following year, after I'd retired from the Senate staff, his daughter invited me to lunch. I should have known something was up. And with the publisher's encouragement, convinced me to implement my own recommendation. Mr. Big Mouth gets his comeuppance. From the start, I realized that the project would take time, lots of time. I spent the next 2 years cutting MacNeil's 250,000-word text in half and adding 30,000 words of my own. I prepared a new introduction, prologue, and conclusion. I repositioned and updated his chapters. The rearranged book begins with a prologue on the challenges facing freshman senators. And then it moves along topically on a subject basis, with the exception of 3 chapters that are the relationship between the Senate and presidents, from George Washington to Barack Obama. That sort of forms the chronological spine of the book, to which you can attach all these subject-based chapters. And the topical chapters can be read as individual essays. For instance, there's one the book begins with the troubled history of Senate elections, and especially campaign financing, which of course is in this morning's newspaper. It will be in newspapers for many weeks to come. We can be sure of that. There's a chapter on Senate floor leadership, with the members who served during the first 2/3 of the Senate's history recognize the role of modern era majority and minority leaders. That's a question. Yeah. Guess, what would the answer to that be? And it's commonly said was commonly said about Senator Byrd that he would have been at home in any Senate, 18th, 19th, or 20th century. He had the rhythm. He knew what it was to be a senator. The only thing that would have been jarring if he'd been in the 18th or 19th century Senate was his role as Senate majority leader and minority leader. That is something entirely modern since the 1950s. There are other chapters on Senate investigations, and for that we owe a big debt of gratitude to the Robert C. Byrd Center, which under Ray's editorial leadership published a magnificent 2-volume history of all congressional investigations, not only Senate but House as well. And there it is, a wonderful teaching tool, and it was one that helped us an awful lot in putting that chapter together. Senate debate, a chapter on Senate debate. Does floor speeches change people's minds? That is, other senators, do they change votes? You have to guess what the answer to that one might be. Relations between the House and the Senate. That's our shortest chapter. That got a big laugh at the Senate. And finally, we trace the development of Senate filibustering over the course of 2 centuries. Has the time finally come, this is right out of recent newspapers, for the Senate to change its rules to end debate, and to end debate by simple majority vote? One more guess. Is that right or not? I'll let Senator Byrd give you a hint about that one. From remarks he made shortly before his death, on the importance of preserving the opportunity for senators to debate at length, he said, "We must never, ever tear down the wall, the one James Madison referred to as the necessary fence this nation has against the excesses of the executive branch and the resultant haste and tyranny of the majority." The tyranny of the majority. So, majority vote. I think we know where Senator Byrd stood on that one. One of Neil's original chapters created a particular headache for me. This big chapter focused on Senate relations with the White House since the days of Harry Truman. It was one of the three in the chronological series of relations between the Senate and the White House, and from Truman's time on. Neil was a great host and a good cook. At one of his dinner parties, he proudly circulated his presidency chapter among his guests. The next day, with the party cleanup completed, he realized that the manuscript, the one that he'd so laboriously produced on his battered manual typewriter, his only copy, was missing. A trip to the landfill proved futile. I wrote that one from scratch. And then there's the matter of footnotes and bibliography. Oxford University Press is both an academic publisher and a commercial publisher. They expect footnotes. Their readers expect footnotes. Neil hated footnotes. Following the practice of some journalists who write history, he chose to identify the sources he considered most unique by simply mentioning them as in the body of the text. So after cutting and revising and expanding the original text, I set out to identify the source of every specific quotation and paraphrase. And I made the mistake of looking up in the Chicago Manual of Style to see what they recommend in terms of what should be footnoted. And what they said was facts, what they do say is facts or opinions not generally known or, get this, easily checked. That's what they want. That's what they want footnotes for. So over the following year, I prepared 1,400. That's 140 times 10. That's 14 times 100. 1,400 footnotes. Much of this would not have been doable, without the well-stocked and open access history collections at the University of Maryland's McKeldin Library that Ray and I have both spent a lot of time in. And also the wonderful online resources of the fabulous Google Books project, where you can find books. There they are, right up. They bring them up from, particularly the older they are, the more likely you're to find them. And finally, the formidable skills of the U.S. Senate Library's reference staff. Without those three, these 1,400 footnotes could not have been done. And in a few instances, however, the source of a quote, despite all these great resources, resisted our most persistent searches. Neil was blessed with an encyclopedic memory and cursed with poor file organization skills. Much of his genius as a reporter lay in his ability mentally to retain stories that he'd heard from senators and congressional staff and other journalists. He also read widely on Congress. He had a huge collection of books on Congress. And he typed. What did he type? Hundreds of 3x5 note cards. You know, the paper stock must have been expensive at that time, because every little inch of white space on those 3x5 note cards was filled with his typing. Great quotes and insights. Sadly, however, by the time those cards reached me, I could detect no conscious organizational scheme in their arrangement. Thousands and thousands of cards. Each one looked great. How do you plug it in when you're trying to tell a larger story? I'm sure if Neil had had the time and the inclination, he might have brought some order to those files, and offered a fighting chance for those of us who were trying to track down quotes, but that didn't happen. And with discernible relief, as my wife Pat can attest, his family transferred to my guest bedroom, our guest bedroom, 50 linear feet of his research materials stuffed into 32 physically challenged storage cartons. And people at the Byrd Center know exactly what's involved in that, for sure. So I naively set out to prepare a preliminary inventory of the folder titles, and I'm making all these cards. And then I realized that I had 10 folders on presidential impeachments. And I had another 10 folders, this is just at the beginning of that project, on leadership. And there were only a couple of pieces of paper in each folder. So that suggested that every time Neil found a new clipping, he created a new folder and wrote a title on it and stuck it in the file. So that was hopeless. I kind of gave up on that. But I want to share with you two examples of really tough quotations that I wasted days trying to track down these quotations. Somebody here is going to go home and look it up and find the answer and let me know, I'm sure. The first one, when and where did Woodrow Wilson say, "The senators of the United States have no use for their heads, except as a knot to keep their bodies from unraveling"? No, that's a pretty searchable kind of quotation. I couldn't find that one. And then there's the Theodore Roosevelt remark from a particularly disagreeable senator from South Carolina. He said, you can almost hear Teddy Roosevelt sighing as he said, "I must work with the material that the states send me." I wonder how many other presidents have thought that when it comes to dealing with Congress. Neil MacNeil's reporting career coincided with Everett Dirksen's 11 years as Senate Republican leader. Neil left the congressional desk of the United Press in 1958 to work for Time magazine, just as Republican senators were choosing Dirksen as their floor leader. As Neil put it, after 1958, it was not possible to write intelligently about the Senate without an intimate knowledge of Everett Dirksen's daily activities. For a little bit later period, the same could be said about Robert Byrd. And in fact, in 1958, Neil had the first opportunity to cover as a reporter for Time, his first Senate election campaign, and that was right here in West Virginia. In 1958, both Senate seats for West Virginia were open. Matthew Neely had died, and that left a balance of his term, and then the other term was up, and both of those seats were held by Republicans. The Democratic challengers were Jennings Randolph, a former House member, and U.S. Representative Robert C. Byrd. During that campaign, Senator Robert Byrd told MacNeil that if he, Byrd, could win that race, he would hold the seat election after election. And both Byrd and Randolph won their respective races by more than 100,000 votes. And true to his forecast, as you all know, Senator Robert Byrd went on to win his next 8 elections to become the longest-serving senator in U.S. history. It's an example of Senator Byrd setting his mind to something, and he made it happen. In 1966, Neil decided, getting back to Everett Dirksen, that he would be a great topic for book-length biography. If he'd been shopping around 20 or 30 years later, he would have landed on Senator Byrd as for a book-length biography. But Everett Dirksen agreed to cooperate. And why wouldn't he? Here he's being asked by the chief congressional correspondent of Time magazine, who wrote a lot of cover features. If anybody could get you on the cover of Time magazine as a member of Congress, it was Neil MacNeil. And indeed, he did get Dirksen a little bit later on the cover of Time magazine. So Dirksen agreed to cooperate fully in the preparing of that biography. Neil particularly admired Dirksen's sympathy for the needs of harried working journalists on Capitol Hill. For example, after the weekly policy luncheons for Republican senators, Dirksen would routinely trudge up to the Senate press gallery to hand out news nuggets to reporters. In our book, MacNeil describes Dirksen's ability to provide something of interest for everyone. For the wire services, he offered a catchy phrase that might make a headline. For serious newspapers, he gave a, quote, somber analysis of the crisis of the moment. And for the news weeklies, he sketched the graphic details of the behind-the-scenes carryings on, something that MacNeil would certainly have appreciated. Last year, MacNeil's family liberated our guest bedroom by donating his 50 linear feet of research files to the Dirksen Congressional Center in Pekin, Illinois. And the center, I'm happy to report, will soon have those papers organized. Perhaps they'll reveal the sources of the Roosevelt and Wilson quotations, as well as a few other classic stumpers that I ran into. I hope so, because my footnotes in this book point the users of the book for questionable comments, remarks in the book, to the Dirksen Congressional Center, where the papers are being processed. I'm sure they'll find them, those sources. I've been asked about the challenges of taking over another writer's work. Excuse me, just 1 minute. Thank you. Taking over another writer's work in midstream. When an author named Paul Reed finished the final book of William Manchester's 3-volume biography of Winston Churchill, C-SPAN's Brian Lamb asked him, quote, "Can one tell from reading this book where Manchester ends and where you start?" Terminally ill Manchester had resisted turning over his project to anyone. He blamed, quote, he lamented, having someone take over this would be like a mother giving away her child. And as Paul Reed responded, "Bill, if the mother doesn't give away her child, then they're both going to die." I tried to give this manuscript a 21st century voice, whatever that is. What I did know to do was to mute the occasional breezy mid-20th century writing style favored by Neil's longtime employer and labeled by its critics time speak. Otherwise, I'd like to believe that our writing styles are remarkably compatible. Our book has plenty of anecdotes. As we were writing, we kept in mind the comment of a 19th century biographer of Charlotte Bronte. The quote, the biographer said, "Get as many anecdotes as possible. If you love your reader and want to be read, get anecdotes." Here's one anecdote, and now I'm going to read a little bit from the book. But this anecdote may strike you as timely today as it did observers 88 years ago. There's a real timelessness to this comment, this remark. In March 1925, minutes after being sworn into office at the rostrum of the Senate chamber, Vice President Charles Dawes launched an attack on a sacred Senate institution. What might that have been? The filibuster. Unless the Senate reformed its rules of debate, he asserted, it would surely sacrifice its own, quote, effectiveness, prestige, and dignity. Senators who'd been expecting this outsider, vice president, this legislative greenhorn, to deliver the standard, "I'm not worthy to preside over your deliberations, but I shall earnestly do my homework" address, which the vice presidents usually give when they're brand new on the job as presiding officer of the Senate. Senators registered their shock at the willful temerity of this vice president. Here he was charging that the Senate, in its use of extended debate, was trampling the rights of American people. This shockingly unprecedented event inspired Columbia University professor Lindsay Rogers to compose a book-length lecture to the vice president. In that book, also entitled The American Senate, he wrote, quote, "The undemocratic," this is Lindsay Rogers writing, "the undemocratic, usurping Senate is the indispensable check and balance in the American system, and only complete freedom of debate, none of this cloture, none of these limits, complete freedom of debate permits it to play that role. That's the end of the quote. Contrary to Vice President Dawes, Professor Rogers cautioned the Senate against further limits on this freedom. Adopt majority cloture in the Senate and the character of the American government will be profoundly changed. That argument, of course, survives today every time filibuster reform comes up before the Senate. And here's another vice presidential quote from our book. This one is about crucial turning points in the development of the positions of Senate floor leader, appropriate to where we are today. Vice President John Nance Garner, taking over in March of 1933 as the Senate's presiding officer, made a few seemingly minor changes in the Senate's parliamentary processes. Those adjustments would, however, take on great significance years later. As a longtime member of the House and as its Speaker just before becoming Vice President, Garner saw no reason to change the way that he had chosen to recognize members to speak. Under the Senate rules, the presiding officer is obliged to recognize the senator who first seeks recognition. Garner changed that procedure in May of 1933 a few weeks after becoming vice president, when he recognized Virginia's Senator Carter Glass instead of Indiana Senator Arthur Robinson, who had addressed him first. Robinson was furious. He instantly protested, accusing Garner of the unforgivable sin of, Ray, catch this, the unforgivable sin of substituting the House's rules for the Senate. You know, they have that over there in the House, but that's a different world, different universe, and here comes this former House Speaker, and he's trying to do what they do in the House. Can't happen, said Senator Robinson. Garner, in response, said that his policy was to give preferential recognition to the senator serving as floor manager of the pending bill. And Carter Glass, as chairman of the Appropriations Committee and a former Treasury Secretary, then was in charge of a pending banking bill, a very big bill. In effect, he was temporarily the Senate's acting floor leader. Vice President Garner meant this only as a courtesy to the bill's high-status manager, nothing more. But this was new doctrine. No senator challenged his ruling, therefore giving it the consequential status as a Senate precedent, right up there like a Senate rule, just beneath a Senate rule in terms of its importance and its applicability. 4 years later, still vice president, Garner enlarged his policy on recognition, extending it to floor leaders. He would recognize the Senate's majority leader or the Senate's minority leader whenever either of them sought the floor. When Garner stated this to the Senate in August of 1937, claiming that he saw this procedure as his duty, his words touched off a somewhat confused debate, but no senator seriously challenged his decision, which seemed of no great importance. But through the 1940s and the early 1950s, the Garner precedent would mature into the floor leader's right to orchestrate the Senate's operations with extraordinary control. And who comes marching in out of Texas in the early 1950s? But none other than Lyndon Johnson, who grabbed on to this ruling with this flimsily, recently established precedent and used it as the absolute basis of his ability to pull the strings in the Senate. It would not have been possible 20 years earlier, for sure. And Senator Byrd picked up, and Senator Byrd had enormous respect for the floor skills, the Senate floor skills of Lyndon Johnson, and Johnson, to a large extent, was Senator Byrd's teacher in some of that. Well, no Senate book would be complete without a reference to the so-called Great Triumvirate of Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, representing the respective sections of the country in the early and mid-19th century. Here's what our book has to say about the way that these senators operated during their time in the Senate. Elected to the Senate in 1827, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts had been reluctant to become a senator. Henry Clay also preferred the House of Representatives to what he called the solemn stillness of the Senate, where he briefly had served for 20 years earlier. But Clay returned in 1831, partly at Daniel Webster's insistence, Webster having gone there in 1827, and John Calhoun, aware of the Senate's rising importance, resigned the vice presidency. There was nothing at stake in that job at the end of 1832 to accept election to the chamber over which he had been presiding for the past 7 years. All of a sudden, he became powerful within the context of the Senate. Only then were all three of these so-called great senators of the Golden Age together, and they changed the Senate forever. At times, they were allies and political partners, joining in fierce fights with their common enemy, President Andrew Jackson. At times, they were rivals. All three wanted the presidency, and all three tried for it repeatedly. Each, however, was recognized as the champion for his region. Webster for the North, Calhoun for the South, and Clay for the West. They engaged in many debates. Their quarrels, even if couched in the stylish courtesies of Senate oratory, were often bitter and personally offensive. Clay hated Jackson and Calhoun. Thomas Hart Benton hated Calhoun. Calhoun hated Clay and Jackson. And John Quincy Adams hated Webster. And to complete this circle of animosity, Jackson hated Calhoun and Clay. At times, only the dignified and artificial politeness required in Senate speech-making allowed them to converse with one another at all. In his prime, Daniel Webster struck listeners with awe. His voice was a rich baritone, and when he spoke, his eyes glistened like burning anthracite. One admirer said that God Almighty never made a man half as wise as Webster looked. Another said that his every word seemed to weigh 12 pounds. He was a master of gorgeous prose, and he delivered his speeches in profound and measured tones. Describing Alexander Hamilton's contributions as the nation's first Treasury Secretary, Webster said this: He smote the rock of national resources, and abundant streams of revenue gushed forth. He smote the rocks of national resources, and abundant streams of revenue gushed forth. He touched, Webster continues, he touched the dead corpse of public credit, and it sprang upon its feet. Reserved socially and at times personally unpleasant, Daniel Webster was respected and admired, but not popular. Senator Byrd said that to me one time. I want to be respected. I don't care if I'm popular. John Calhoun, austere and cold in public, was a kind and engaging man. Calhoun from South Carolina. Kind and engaging in his private dealings. When he rose to speak in the Senate, he spoke right out, without adornment, cold, stiff, and grim, but eloquent at times. Calhoun seriously claimed that his political career from its beginning was totally consistent, despite, you might say, what a laugh, despite obvious evidence to the contrary, and that he had never had the slightest interest in becoming president. The South Carolina legislature, aware of the profits reaped by his state's plantation owners, bent his powerful intellect to a justification of human slavery, a good, a great good. Slavery, he said, is indispensable to Republican government. For slave owners in the South, John Caldwell Calhoun was a hero. But by far the most colorful of the three was Henry Clay. He was elegant in debate, haughty and imperious at times, gracious and chivalric in others. He commanded a fiery eloquence that won him national popularity and national attention. As an orator, he could be witty and clever, dignified and high-toned, bold and impetuous, whatever posture seemed appropriate, and he was especially genial and winning in his personality. He had a readiness in debate that Webster greatly admired as a precious thing in an hour of need. In other words, he had a very, very quick mind. Above all, Clay had a special gift for bringing even antagonistic senators into agreement by compromise. A passionate advocate himself, he was willing to take high political risks to achieve his legislative purposes. What is a public man worth, he asked, who will not sacrifice himself, if necessary, for the good of his country? Read that again. What is a public man worth, who will not sacrifice himself, if necessary, for the good of his country? That should be engraved in marble, sort of over the entrance to the Capitol building. This time, from Webster's, or the time period from Webster's initial oath-taking in 1827 to the death of Clay in 1852, amounted to a little more than a quarter of a century. Over those 25 years, however, the three men served together in the Senate for less than 10 years. All quit the Senate at various times, Webster twice, only to return later. For 2 years, from 1843 to 1845, all three were not there at all. The reality was that they found the Senate in their time less glorious than the later reputation of the golden age of the Senate. So if the Senate did not have a golden age in the 1830s and 40s, when did it have a golden age? Well, I think we're on to something if we follow that line of thinking. Henry Clay himself could be savage in debate. So could many others. In 1832, Clay and Missouri's Thomas Hart Benton engaged in a shouting match so ugly that senators feared a fist fight on the Senate floor. They were gabbled into silence. Both apologized to the Senate, but not to each other. Clay disparaged President Jackson in language so offensive that the president, in a fury, likened Clay to a drunk in a whorehouse. Tough words, Mr. President. In a badly chosen moment, Calhoun once boasted that he had bested Clay in an earlier debate. He said, "I had mastery over him on that occasion." Clay was on him instantly. "My master! Sir, I would not own him for the meanest of my slaves." Calhoun was crushed by the reply, and for years he refused to speak to Clay. In a remark that has been taken as illustrative of the peculiar nature of friendship in the Senate, Calhoun said of Clay, "I don't like Henry Clay. He is a bad man, an impostor, a creator of wicked schemes. I wouldn't speak to him, but by God," I think some of you heard this before, "but by God, I love him." Former Senate Majority Leader Howard Baker delighted in that quote a few years back when he delivered to the Senate community an address on the vital importance of mutual toleration among senators. While senators over the years have had innumerable occasions to dislike one another, they have, for the most part, recognized their obligation to get along in pursuit of the nation's best interest. After all, one definition of the word Congress is to come together. And I just interject here that in 1995, a freshman senator named Rick Santorum got on the floor of the Senate and began to refer to the president as Bill this and Bill that, and such language had not been seen for a long while. All of a sudden, here comes Senator Byrd out of his nearby office onto the floor of the Senate. People, almost the air was being sucked out of the chamber as Senator Byrd rose and administered a polite, somewhat polite, but a lecture to Senator Santorum, never mentioning him by name in the record, as to the nature of courtesy in the Senate. And that speech of Senator Byrd's overnight became a classic on how to behave as a senator. And again, it ought to be required reading for all senators today, for sure. Well, back to the 19th century very briefly, just as I conclude here. Former President John Quincy Adams, a House member from Massachusetts who dearly wanted to be a senator, but Daniel Webster did not want John Quincy Adams as his seatmate from Massachusetts, a former president. He wanted somebody he could control, and Adams was not the one, so he never achieved his goal to be a senator. But John Quincy Adams reluctantly honored the definition of civility in his relations with Senators Clay, Webster, and Calhoun. He considered each of these men to be legislative giants, even as he grew to despise all of them. John Quincy Adams confided in his diary in March 1835 his frustration over trying to prepare a speech for delivery in the House of Representatives that would undercut the support of Calhoun and Webster for a bill that he, Adams, opposed. He acknowledged that his draft speech contained remarks that were, as he put it, contemptuous and disdainful. He was sitting there at night writing these out, and that's the way the words flowed out of his pen. He continued, "Calhoun's tone is so self-sufficient and overbearing, and Webster's reasoning is so utterly ignorant and unprincipled that they provoked my temper, and I answer them with cutting sarcasm." But then Adams caught himself. He said, "The use of this weapon, sarcasm, is seldom politic." He decided that he should redraft the speech, as he put it, to quote, "say in mild, courteous, inoffensive language what I have said in consuming caustic words." And you can always feel his frustration. I can make no use of that speech as written, and yet it contains material to grind up into dust the arguments of Calhoun and Webster. It's a great speech, and yet in good conscience I don't feel I can go out there on the floor of the House and give it. You'll see in our book that the Senate, from the moment of its creation in 1787, has generated throughout the nation both frustration, this kind of frustration, and a sense of pride. The Senate has risen to meet enormous challenges, and crippled by its inherent flaws, and it has many inherent flaws, has fallen periodically into a state of functional paralysis. The current Senate is a legislative body in transition. It has always been in transition, from the early aspirations of the Constitution's framers through its golden age of classical oratory and on into the corruption of the post-Civil War Gilded Age to the progressive reforms that followed in the 1910s, the 1930s, and the 1960s, and finally down to the cacophony of our own times. Its nearly 2,000 members have included statesmen and politicos, brilliant legislative tacticians, fiery demagogues, time servers, and lots and lots of former high school class presidents. In essence, it's a genuine cross-section of the nation's political class. I think there are two possible responses to the predictable question that has been asked about the Senate ever since the early 1800s, almost ever since it was first convened. Would the framers of the U.S. Constitution recognize today's Senate, whether today is 1800, 1850, or today? The first answer, if one focuses on the fundamentals of the Senate's operations under the Constitution, is yes, they probably would. The second answer is not a chance. The fact that enlightened individuals can render such opposing judgments suggests that the Senate is a functioning, if awkward, institution in need of regular revision. I can't emphasize that enough, in need of regular revision, and it gets it. Scanning the 2+ century landscape of its existence, one will note significant change coming in episodic and unplanned bursts. And one will also note, here we said this a minute or two ago, to persistent frustration. This book seeks to identify the Senate's historical rhythms and place these oscillations in that context. And just as researchers who come to this splendid research facility may develop a new appreciation for the life and services of Robert C. Byrd, my fondest hope for those of you who actually read this book is that it may cause you to look at the Senate through new and fresh eyes. Thank you very much. Yeah.